for joining and participating in this discussion. As you probably just got notified, we'll be recording this just to use internally and be able to share with some of our other members if they have questions, but just wanted to flag that this is being recorded. I'll be going through a discussion with Jake, Representative Byrd, and Senator Lundeen, but please feel free to submit questions in the chat or hold them till the end. We'll have a little bit of opportunity for Q&A as well. So thank you again. This is our CSI members legislative recap. We just went through another vigorous and significant legislative session. I just want to say that ultimately CSI, we're very fortunate to be part of a network, a network of members, board members, organizations, and fellows who are very engaged throughout this process to help inform the laws that govern our state. And so we wanted to have this as an opportunity to discuss. Thank you especially to our board members joining the call: Tyrone Adams with Colorado Association of Realtors, Dave Davia with Rocky Mountain Mechanical Contractors, and Charlie McNeil with NextGen Energy. Again, very significant voices in the community and throughout this legislative process. So I want to kick it over to Jake Zambrano, our legislative director, just for a few remarks about CSI's engagement and some of the highlights from the session.
You bet, and thank you, Chris. And I'll tell you what, I've been doing this with Common Sense Institute for the better part of 10 years now, and the depth and breadth from which we approached this session has never been greater from a CSI standpoint. And I think a couple of highlights are important that we should point out. We had 11 people from the organization, whether that be a board member, a fellow, or a staff member, testify on a whole myriad of bills that were contemplated in the legislature. We published 27 reports or papers or one-pagers in the window of the legislative session. Those reports generated roughly 350 media mentions across the state. And some of the highlights from that were, and Representative Byrd, your work on the para legislation, which Earl Wright testified on in the Senate. Dave Davia on House Bill 1090. Our water fellows had a conversation in the building with a business and water partner. And then Jason Galden testified on a school transportation bill that was very near and dear and important to him. We also saw fellows Brockler and Morrissey testify on an auto theft bill. And then, of course, workforce and gig economy bills were front and center during the session. We saw JJ Ament with the Denver Chamber, who was on this board, testify on Fair Work Week. Dave Davia and his team on the healthcare single payer study. Tyrone and his team on Senate Bill 213 and the housing question that the governor was sent upstairs for contemplation. So we were all over the board, which kind of had us on certain days running a pure on zone defense, which was fun. And it had us kind of working in a lot of different subject areas. And I think Kelly will attest, and Chris, I know will, we're a lean and mean team. There's not a bunch of policy folks hauled up in an office building churning out content. Really, the people you see on this call are the ones that drive a lot of that. And so really proud of that accomplishment, what we did and what we think we added to the conversation, and really looking forward to hearing more about that and talking more about that this morning with all of you. So thank you, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. Can't believe it's been 10 years. We've been working together for almost 6 now. It's every time I say it, it's incredible.
And you keep looking more and more handsome.
I try to dress more like you every day as well.
Right.
That's the trick, Jake. So thank you all, and again, thank you to our special guests. Probably don't need much of an introduction, but Representative Shannon Byrd with House District 29, representing parts of Adams and Jefferson County. She's the Vice Chair of Appropriations and Vice Chair of the Joint Budget Committee. Also, very happy to be joined by Senator Paul Lundeen, representing Senate District 9 in El Paso County. He's the Senate Minority Leader and sits on the Education Committee and the Legislative Executive Committee as well. I hope I got those right. So, again, very excited to have this conversation. We have, about 20, let's say 20 minutes or so, and then we'd like to open it up for Q&A. And to those listening, please, again, feel free to submit questions through the chat, and I can field some of those as they come in if it may help, further expand on a particular question or address something, or it may just hold on till the end and ask it there. But we wanted to bring you both on as you're sensible, I dare say, common sense legislators with a sensible approach to how to debate policy. So wanted to have this conversation, bring to light some of the key issues that both CSI studied and that you worked on. So I'd like to just start with, kind of simple question from your perspective, maybe kick it to you, Representative Byrd, to start. But what were the legislative high points and maybe low points from your perspective?
So a high point, I would say, would be our state's investment in education this year. I'm really excited about that. It's our constitutional responsibility, and I think something that everybody really cares about, making sure that we are appropriately investing in our system of public education. And it wasn't just K-12. So K-12, I think, got most of the attention, where we have this this unfunded liability. State has all kinds of unfunded liabilities, but since we're talking about education, there's this term, the budget stabilization factor, which is an amount that our state has been discounting its payment and share of funding to public schools by every single year since the Great Recession back in 2010. And finally, this year, we cut that budget stabilization factor in half and have a commitment to completely eliminate that factor next year. So I'm very excited about that. I think we set the stage also for some really thoughtful education policy next year. Specifically, one of the pieces of the School Finance Act is a request that we actually cost out what does it cost us to educate a student in the state of Colorado. So I can't wait to see that. That seems to be a really smart thing to do. For too often, what we've done in our state is back into how we fund our schools. Instead of asking how much does everything we've asked our schools to do actually cost, we figure out how much money we have left over, and that's what gets allocated to our public schools. And that's really not a smart way to fund anything that you say you care about. So that is a high point for me. I'll also say our contribution to our institutions of higher education, very excited about that. A lot of our public universities faced a lot of the same pressures, well, honestly, all of the same pressures that our private sector businesses did in terms of rising costs, inflation, labor shortages, all kinds of challenges brought on by the volatility in our economy as of late. So we were able to come up with an investment package for them, support from the state that put in as much as we could to help them stave off at least the cost of inflation and allow them to be thoughtful with how they levy tuition, how that's assessed, and make sure that they can cover their costs and still remain competitive and be a place where our students want to come and where we're able to attract talent for our institutions of higher ed. So that's the high point. Low point, I'm certain we're going to get there. I have a sense of what our agenda is, so I won't go there right yet because we'll dive right into that, I'm certain, at some point during the call.
Great. Yeah, Senator Lundin, your thoughts?
Fair enough. And I appreciate Rep. Byrd's perspective, and I appreciate, quite frankly, her presence constantly in the policy dialogue. I would agree that on the high point side, better funding of public education is key. Now, we were able to garner a number of votes. It was, I would argue, a Republican-led initiative that, in fact, dramatically bought down, I guess, the allowance that the Joint Budget Committee provided for was meaningful and a significant improvement in K-12. A Republican-led effort added an additional $50 million to buy down on the budget stabilization factor. We, of course, have been arguing for years that, in fact, the first budget priority of state government should be K-12 education funding, because Amendment 23 provides that at a constitutional level, and therefore funding education should be first, not last, after we've done all the other things that get done. I had an analysis done by the Office of Legislative Legal, actually by the Legislative Council, and they identified 167 new departments, offices, and agencies of state government that have been created since 2009, when this budget sophistry that Representative Byrd talked about, the budget stabilization factor, which was a way for us to wink at our constitutional responsibility to fully fund education. So the BS factor was put in place in 2009 instead of getting right after the business of meeting our constitutional obligation to fully fund public education. In fact, we've grown state government by 167 different offices, departments, and programs of state government. So very, very pleased that we're making headway. I was the prime sponsor, along with Rep. Senzinger in the Senate, on the School Finance Act, and I was able to write into the School Finance Act. It was what I would call a ticket to ride, that we would, in fact, fully pay off the budget stabilization factor next year. I argued we should do it this year, but it was not done. But I was able to get written into law that we will do it as a matter of course next year, fully fund public education as required under Amendment 23. And something that doesn't get as much attention, you have a sister organization out there that goes by the exact same letters, CSI, the Charter School Institute. When a local school district is not willing to authorize a charter school, they have recourse through the State Board of Education to be authorized by the Charter School Institute. Well, it just so happens that as of today, about 17% of the students in Colorado that are in K-12 public education are in fact going to a charter school. Public schools are charter schools are public schools. And for years now, those Charter School Institute students, even if they have a sister or brother who lives down the hallway and goes to a different neighborhood school, those Charter School Institute students are funded at a lower level than their sister or brother or kids across the street who may be going to a neighborhood school. We were also able to write into the School Finance Act language that says, as we in fact pay off the budget stabilization factor, we will stop funding Charter School Institute authorized charter students at a level lower than their neighboring neighborhood school students. And so we got that written into law. So I would say education is one place where we had I would argue, Republican-led, but certainly Democrat-supported effort. I'm going to call out another high point of the legislative session, at least from my perspective, was the way that we in the state Senate were able to stand and fight. And we fought in a way that honored the First Amendment. We fought in a way that said, we're going to stand and deliver our perspective on the issues of the day. And we, Republicans and Democrats, were able to do that in a meaningful, challenging, difficult, and yet at the same time collegial way in alignment with decorum. And I'm grateful for the way we were able to do that in the Senate. There were more challenges in the House, I realize. And I would give, again, I'm going to throw a bouquet to Rep. Byrd. She is one of those individuals who is willing, and she and I sometimes stand and go toe to toe in vigorous disagreement over issues. But I believe we both choose to do it, and we successfully do it in a way that honors the process and honors the people we serve. So I would call that out as a potential high point. And yeah, low points, there's a lot to talk about. Let me just go ahead and kick one of the cans over here right now. I'm going to kick a can of worms over. I would argue that Senate Bill 303, which will be put before the voters as Proposition HH, is in fact the low point of the session. It was dropped on the people with 6 days left in the session. It is a $11 billion, over 10 years expansion of government, all forms. It is a bait and switch game that takes away from the taxpayers a fundamental portion of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights refund that is due to them in order to pretend like we're actually restraining property taxes, but in fact, we are just changing taxes by another name on the shoulders of the people of Colorado. I objected to 303, said we should in fact kill that bill and come back for a special session to truly, directly, actually address the property tax crisis in Colorado. But that is not the way things are going. And I would argue part of the reason why they're not going that way, and quite frankly, part of the reason that causes our circumstance to be so challenging, and this is why I'm calling it out as a low point, is that 303 was written largely to support the funding desires of CEA, the Colorado Education Association. And the Colorado Education Association has shown, tragically, some of their stripes by passing, their main body passed and codified a resolution that says the CEA believes that capitalism inherently exploits children, public schools, land, labor, and resources, and went on to make statements beyond that. So 303, in a way, is $11 billion, over the next 10 years to fund, in a large part, people that think capitalism is inherently evil. And that is a low point in the public discourse in Colorado.
Well, I'd like to maybe revisit 303 and HH as we come back towards the end and look forward. But since you both highlighted education and education funding as a high point, and I also know Representative Byrd, there was a accountability task force that I think will be formed to look deeper into some of the K-12 issues. Just want to highlight for our members, for you, this August, September, we'll be releasing our updated dollars and data report, which highlights and looks at the history of K-12 spending across districts, across the state. And will be fascinating to see and add in some of the dimensions specifically as it relates to the budget stabilization factor and what this session means for K-12 funding going forward. So thank you there. Maybe quickly, I wanted to get this in, and then I want to talk about a few specific issues, but what we hear a lot about highlights. Is there one particular piece of legislation or maybe one or two that you wanted to highlight that you think went under the radar? And is there anything you would call attention to that, again, maybe didn't get quite the headlines, but has a significant impact on our state's free enterprise system or economy going forward that, again, may have gone under the radar?
If I might, I don't know that it's a piece of legislation, but I think people on your call need to know, and this is something that I don't think made the headlines, how well your budget writers work together. So we have a committee of 6 individuals, 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate, who work together to draft the state's budget. 5 of us were new members, with 1 returning member, which was our chair. And it's a bipartisan group. And I don't know that any of you know this, but I previously served on our city council. And city councils, when they function best, they function as nonpartisan entities where people show up to do the work, to come in and solve problems and make a city work. And in my time during the legislature, I've just finished my 5th session. This committee, the Joint Budget Committee, operated so similarly to my city council, where people were not flying partisan flags. We were there to craft a budget that worked for the state of Colorado. So maybe that is one piece of legislation, the long bill, which was our state budget. And there will be things in there that people love. There will be things in there that people aren't in love with. But I think that's like anything. But that was crafted, and I think for the first time in at least 4 years, we had fully bipartisan support, unanimous support from the members of our Joint Budget Committee. So that is something definitely to celebrate. We all got behind that, all supported the changes in the law that needed to be made to account for some of the spending changes that were implemented through the bill. So I offer that to you all. And it did make me think of one thing I did want to share as a low point, and this is something important for every citizen in our state to be mindful of. This year, I've seen partisanship and political polarization go off the charts. And this is not just a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It was both sides of the aisle that I think showed us what we don't want, what we need to put a stop to. We need better civic engagement. from all of us when we elect people to come in and serve and to represent you. Please elect problem solvers and people who understand that to get something done, you have to work with people. It's not someone who comes to fight. You never cut a deal when you're there to fight. You cut a deal when you're there with a mind to solve problems. So that to me was a low point of the session. And I'm very hopeful that perhaps cooler heads prevail during the interim, and that more of us have this ethos of rolling up our sleeves to actually solve problems rather than flying partisan flags.
And I would jump in on the same kind of set of issues and say that it is a story that maybe didn't get highlighted, but it is an important story. And that is where we were able to, Republicans and Democrats come together to restrain some of the policy offerings that were made. The election, my perspective, was largely settled in 2022 based on ideological grounds, a distaste for a certain Republican national figure, and the passing by the Supreme Court, or the repealing by the Supreme Court through the Dobbs decision, and the innervation of a question around abortion rights. That the election was determined based on a strong personality and a personal ideological issue. But what happened is the resulting body of individuals that came into the Colorado General Assembly was the presentation of a large number of economically threatening pieces of policy. It's not a secret, it's a matter of public record. There are 5 members in the Colorado House who are card-carrying members of Democrat Socialists of America. That speaks to that hyper-partisan nature that does exist, at least on one side, and we have ours on the Republican side as well. There's one member in the Colorado Senate who's also a card-carrying member of the Democrat Socialists of America. So that's 6 legislators with 5 bills apiece. So that's 30 starting points of a policy conversation that comes from an extreme perspective. We were able to kill a dozen bills in the Senate. At one point, the rumor was going around, they were calling the Senate the red room of death, where, things like the idea that you should unionize all individuals who choose to stand up a small enterprise and participate in the gig economy. They should become a member of a union or an employee of a large corporation. A bill that would have promoted that died. Rent control died. There were a number of bills that are just bad economic policies that were presented. And this is where, again, bouquet of flowers to Representative Byrd and others like her in the Democrat caucus, who fought for common sense, who were willing to cross the aisle and stand against some of these stronger ideas. So there's 2 points in this story that's unreported. One is where the policy conversation started. Extremely liberal or progressive or collectivist or socialistic in its nature in many presentations. And the other side of that story is how Republicans fought against it, and common sense Democrats like Representative Byrd and others. I mean, there are 2 members in the Senate who I must have told them a half a dozen times, you know what, brother, I fought like the dickens for you not to be here. And I am so glad you are here in this moment, because they were actually standing on principle. They were doing exactly what Rep. Byrd said needed to happen. And that is to say, no, this is a bridge too stinking far. We're not going to do it. And they voted against it. So those are 2 kind of nuanced below the surface stories that are probably somewhat underreported.
Well, so to maybe build on that and talk a little about some of the policies you just brought up. And before I do that, I'd like to maybe offer, one issue that kind of went under the radar. One of our economic mobility fellow, Tamara Ryan, featured it to some degree in her work in the middle of session. But the bill you led, Representative Byrd, the expansion of the earned income tax credit and child care tax credit, I think those and the funding of those, I think provide an interesting opportunity and sort of juxtaposition to other wage policy and debates around public benefits and minimum wage that I think offer some again greater benefits for Colorado moving forward. So just wanted to throw that out there. But in that vein, another report done by CSI fellow, Free Enterprise fellow Lang Sias, that was released late in the session, talked about the state's economic competitiveness, highlighting recent legislation and the aggregation of recent legislation in two key areas: energy, environment, and labor and employment. And three pieces of legislation or propositions that passed in the last 3 years have added about $1 billion in direct costs in the area of labor and employment. And several of the other bills that were included really we couldn't quantify, including mandates on sick leave, and all done in maybe the right spirit, but in aggregate present pretty significant costs indirectly to employers and cause again direct labor costs, tension between employers and employees. We did work explicitly on two pieces of legislation: 1118, the Fair Workweek Bill or Predictive Scheduling Bill, and SB 98, which you mentioned, the Gig Worker Transparency Bill. I'd be curious if you wanted to maybe offer any more insights into the topic of laws that change policy in the area of labor and employment that maybe see as adding to this cost tally, or maybe net benefit, or if you wanted to speak to those two pieces of legislation, given they both did not pass, but I am hearing and maybe would expect in some form those ideas to return. So maybe kick it to you, Representative Byrd, since maybe you spoke a little bit about it, but and then we're getting up against our time, but if we want to take a few minutes and just sort of address this, and then I'd like to get into housing and then open up for some questions of the audience.
So yes, and I want to say for the record, I agree with everything that you've said. I know that we've had a steady drumbeat of policy that keeps coming back, and then building on policy that maybe had good intentions but had questionable outcomes, and even with the questionable outcome, people deciding that was adequate foundation to build more policy on. So I share concerns with what this is doing, particularly to smaller businesses that don't necessarily have an attorney on retainer that can help them understand and navigate Colorado laws. People just want to run their businesses and not be worried about, how long you need to keep your payroll records for. Is it 3 years this time, or is it now 5 years, or is it 7 years? And even rules like that seem to keep changing. So that they all cause me great concern. I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because now I don't get to sit on many of the traditional committees that vet these policies, which sort of makes me sad because I was a first line of defense before on business and also the finance committees, but now I get to do the budget, that's great work too, but do miss this. I know I would have voted against both of these for a lot of the reasons that Chris, you just mentioned, but also one thing I'm sort of wondering how this is going to play out. We have a really tight labor market. So a lot of the policy that people are trying to pass in terms of the gig worker transparency, even the Fair Work Week, if workers had challenges with unpredictable schedules, how much of that gets resolved because employers are in a different position where they need to have more worker-friendly policies and can't do things that turn people off. I mean, this is, I think, right up CSI's alley, where we understand that it's a market economy. And if you're doing things that turn workers off, you're going to have a really hard time recruiting and retaining the workforce you need for a thriving business. So I am hopeful that the tight labor market will pull the plug on some of the impetus for some of this legislation. Having said that, I know that that's very Pollyanna and probably not likely to come to pass. I suspect much of this will come back again. And if it makes it out of committee, I know I'm not supportive of it.
Yeah, and I would dive in and say, earned income tax credit, especially for dependent children, is a provable economic theory that conservatives can believe in. I mean, that makes sense as opposed to jacking up the minimum wage, jacking up the minimum wage, jacking up the minimum wage. Next thing we know, just everything is more expensive, and the people who are making minimum wage are now making $20 an hour, and they can't afford anything more than they could afford before. that is the net effect of that. So having a more surgical approach to that's just good economic policies. The challenge we have is, and as I look across the Senate floor, my caucus is a bunch of people like myself who did something with their life, provided value. I don't like the phrase give back, but because I believe that the companies I stood up, the employees I hired, the products I provided into the marketplace, I was giving to my community every day of the week when we were doing that. I was risking my personal capital to do that. But now I'm in a place where I've chosen to give back in a different way as an elected official. When I look across the Senate floor, the bulk of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and Rep. Byrd's a notable exception in the House, are individuals who have made a life, a career out of political advocacy. They've worked for one C4, then another C3. Not that I dislike C4s and C3s. I think they have a very important role in the conversation. But when that's all that an individual has done is work their way up in an ideological pathway in pursuit of a set of particular policies that are collectivist in nature, that quite frankly, my perspective, are in pursuit of economic policies that have proven not to function, that have proven to fail, but that's what they bring year after year after year. I mean, you look at the Power Act. We had the Power Act, an effort to bring the Power Act not only to the businesses of Colorado, but to the school children of Colorado. They wanted the school children of Colorado to have access to and live to the same rules that the Power Act would have created in the workplaces. That is the ideological perspective that is showing up at the door, bringing policies that start in the extreme, and it becomes our job, commonsensical legislators, whether Republican or Democrat, to restrain them or kill them. And quite frankly, we need to be prepared that they will come back newly energized, recently re-advocated, shinier with brighter, shinier objects attached to them next legislative session. And that's where a group like CSI and the report, the economic competitiveness report that Lang did, I love that. I'm grateful for that. It's something we need to be leaning into and looking into, because elections matter, and it's not all about one or two extreme ideological issues. It's about what the state will look like 10 years, 20 years from today, and whether it will be habitable or not for businesses.
Fantastic. And I guess another area that we saw a significant amount of policy focus on, and has been an area of topic for our research for a couple of years now, is housing and housing affordability. And another significant piece of legislation, House Bill 213, the land use bill, did not pass. And we don't need to rehash all of that. If you wanted to feature any, talk about any specifics of it, but the question I think I have and would be interested in getting your thoughts on were the specific elements related to the state intervening in some way in statewide zoning. And that was the main holdup it appeared to be. And I think in it, I'd also be curious to get your thoughts and maybe juxtaposition with the bill that did pass that overturned growth caps and limitations on restricting permitting at the local level. So on one hand, we have some laws that now say you can't restrict permitting, but the issue around restricting zoning is still outstanding, I guess, in some ways. And so I'd be curious to get your thoughts on 213, the main sticking point, and is there a path forward on, I guess, that central question around the state intervening around zoning?
I would love to jump into that. So starting with the piece of legislation that removed caps on growth, I think I voted for that policy. I think that's the right thing to do. When one community says we're not going to allow growth beyond a certain number of new units every single year, that puts an artificial depression or ceiling really on demand. What happens to demand that otherwise would have occurred in that city? Now all of the people who have been looking for a place to live in that city, and now they can't find anything because there's a growth cap, now are pushed out to other cities. And now other cities have bid up demand for their available units. And that only drives up cost of housing in all of your surrounding metropolitan areas. So what I liked about undoing the growth caps is that cities still can say what they want their communities to look like, but they can't put an artificial cap on what happens, on how many people move there. You can't close the door after you've gone and set up shop there. So I like the fact that communities still get to design what they look like, but you can't close the door behind you. That has negative impacts on everybody else who lives around you. And that's the same thing that would have happened had we passed the rent control bill. Same thing, that was pitched as an idea where, oh, you in your community, you decide if that's right for you. Well, it has such incredible negative externalities for all of your neighbors. So we definitely have a statewide concern and can't allow neighbors to do that to one another. On 213, I understand how that might have seemed very attractive to people who are attempting to build and wanting some consistency in zoning and regulations. But as a former member of city council and local government, I have to tell you, some of the most passionate, contentious hearings we had to deal with what was happening in undeveloped or land that people wanted to change zoning with. This was something people really care about, what their communities look like. And the changes envisioned by Senate Bill 213 would have taken away your right as a citizen, no matter where you sit, taken away your right to petition your locally elected representatives who are responsible to you and accountable to you through your vote. You would no longer be able to petition them in a meaningful manner to talk about what you want your city and neighborhood to look like. Instead, all of that authority would have been vested in a group of appointed people appointed by the governor that resided in Denver. So even if I thought that was okay, and assuming that it's okay to take away your local elected's responsibility to you to help co-design your community, Westminster, we can easily go to Denver and go bang on an unelected bureaucrat's door. I don't know how responsive they will be to that, but what about people in Telluride or in Brush, Colorado, Delta, Colorado, Montrose, Ouray? Are we going to ask these people if they have a concern about a plot of land across the street from their neighborhood? No longer can they deal with their neighbors and talk about what their community looks like. They will now have to go to Denver. So I'm passionately opposed to that. I think that's wrong. I think it disenfranchises us and makes government much less responsive to us. I think the much better role for government, if we want to be in this space, would be to be better partners and perhaps offer more incentives. We can tie more of our grant funding to what we deem, whoever the we is at the time this happens. But if we think there's statewide concern with respect to zoning policy, then maybe we tie some of our grant funding to whatever is determined to be more responsible land use policies. If you want to use state dollars for affordable housing, how are you using that? What does your land use look like? So I'm much more in favor of a partnership, an incentive approach, but definitely not a complete usurpation of the citizens' right to petition their local government.
Yes,
Yeah, I'd jump in and I would simply say, I would say a few things slightly differently, but generally I'm almost in universal agreement with everything that Rep. Byrd has just said regarding growth caps and regarding the framing of statewide zoning. Let me talk about two dogs that did not bark in this particular conversation. One's a process foul. The governor and I sat down every other week pretty much throughout the session. And like on week number one, I said, we're going to want to talk to you about property tax relief, and I'm going to want to talk to you about land use because you've made a big deal about the fact you're going to do everything through land use. And I got a hand on my forehead throughout the entire session. And then we got bills introduced late in the game. We had said, we want to be in conversation. We want iron to sharpen iron. We want our best perspectives to come into conversation with your best perspectives and see what we can do. And we got none of that. What we got was a Democrat initiative driven by a specific Democrat perspective on what it would look like. And the collectivism in that offering was obvious and very, very uncomfortable. That's item one. Item two is The most important element isn't about how we rejigger zoning requirements or mess with the governance of land use. What matters is the willingness of individuals with capital to deploy capital into the construction of rooftops. And we have a construction defects framework still that does not allow for the development of entry-level housing in a meaningful way. I said that in week number 1 in my conversations with the governor, and that's probably part of the reason he put his hand on my forehead and said, stay out of the conversation, is he didn't want to deal with the fact that this is not a 100 or 200 or $500 million issue. This is a multiple billion-dollar issue that will require the deployment of private capital. Government cannot have, does not have, will never have enough money, nor should it have enough money to develop the rooftops that need to be developed. Instead, we need to change the availability and the willingness. We need to take some of the friction out of the risk assessment process for those who have the capital and would deploy the capital to build affordable housing in Colorado. Construction defects reform must be a fundamental tenet of any land use conversation going forward, and it was rejected. I offered during the course of the debate amendments to the bill that would have done that. Of course, they were rejected without serious consideration in the Senate conversation.
Well, thank you both. And on that last point around housing and construction defects, mentioned that specifically in our testimony, and is something that actually we're in the midst of looking into directly and want to do some reporting on. So we look forward to engaging with both of you and sharing with our members on this call. So before I give you both, maybe, yeah, please
go ahead. You're gonna say what I was hoping you were gonna say. Go ahead.
Well, if before I give you maybe some final closing remarks, opportunity for closing remarks, I just wanted to see if there's any questions. I don't have anything coming in from the chat, from the audience. You must have done a great job of covering all 200 bills that have been signed thus far and a few more that have been awaiting. So then either, pat on the back, or if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
I think what's happened, Chris, is we bored everybody to tears. They've fallen asleep. All right, I'm going to take a freebie here. Something we haven't talked about that plays into economic competitiveness going forward is energy development and the honest prioritization of our efforts in Colorado. We have seen that the development of natural gas has done more to bend the curve on greenhouse gas emissions around the globe than any other development. The replacement of coal-fired electricity with natural gas-fired electricity. Colorado generates an enormous amount of some of the cleanest molecules on the planet. I have asked multiple times, and I would ask that CSI continue to lean into this conversation. At what cost to the people of Colorado? To what benefit the global objectives that we're pursuing? We have a very clear ideological effort to lean into this idea of we're going to save the planet by virtue of the policies we write here in Colorado. Do we have a burden to lead? Absolutely, we have a burden to lead. Do we have a burden to innovate? Absolutely, we have a burden to innovate. But we don't have a burden to make the life in Colorado unaffordable and unattainable for the people of Colorado, as if somehow magically that's going to save the planet. Prioritizing the things we do. 1362, you folks did an analysis on that, passed not this last session, but the session prior, would have made every home developed in Colorado $42,000 more expensive as an effort to lean into this idea of saving the planet, bending the greenhouse gas curve down. We need to say we want a clean planet. We all live together on this beautiful blue-green orb, and we want a clean, better, sustainable future. But at what cost, the people of Colorado? To what benefit? The actual stated objective, which is saving the planet and bending the greenhouse curve down. So research, thinking on that, work on that is so critically important, because the policies being brought are, I think, disconnected from empirical evidence. They're disconnected from definable science and damaging to the affordability of life in Colorado and across America.
Well, on that note, maybe we should have had more questions on the energy front. We're getting some questions in from the audience on this side, and we just want to note that CSI, we have 2 fellows we've announced we're working with on energy and growth, and we'll have a paper on this coming out later this year, and it is something we want to continue to emphasize and focus on without a doubt. So some kudos from Kathy Barstner and Naop in the comments that you can see, and talking about some of the main issues here. One question that maybe leave you with, you can maybe as you offer some final remarks, but maybe leave you with and leave the audience here with as we try to wrap up, is what was, in your opinion, any unfinished business, and what do you expect might be coming back in 2024?
You get to go first, Rep.
In 30 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
You sit in the same caucus meetings. Oh, you want me to go first?
Go first.
I think a lot of the same policies, they're driven by ideological fervor. They're not driven by common sense. They're not driven by empirical evidence or science. And that they're just going to keep coming back. Gig workers are evil workers. Well, I reject that idea. But anyway, you're going to get me going on a speech here, Chris. I mean, a lot of the same bad stuff is going to come back.
Great.
I think so too. Although I'll say on a more positive note, I think that to the extent that people come back with bad ideas again, the people who didn't like it the first time will like it even less the next time. So, people come back with far left ideas. I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing right now. I would say far right, but I'm sorry, Senator Lundeen, the numbers aren't there for your group to have any meaningful.
Just don't have them.
No, although anyway, so they will come back, but those of us who didn't like it will continue to not like it. And I don't see us passing it in the future.
Great. And I know it was touched on, and David, to your question here about sort of the interaction of 303 and 1311 and the outlook for property taxes, absolutely is something CSI will be doing work on. We will be releasing sort of as part of our ballot analysis, certainly going into the fall, but maybe even something we look into sooner. It's a complex issue. I expect in the next several weeks, we may get a better sense of, from the state property tax report, what those assessed values actually look like, or what they're looking like in a more comprehensive way. And maybe we can get some early estimates out on that. But then certainly going into the fall, we plan to do a lot of work just to give people a clear sense of what the trade-offs are, both near-term and long-term, related to the question before them of reducing property assessment rates and their tax rates to some degree, while lifting the Tabor cap to a large degree, as Senator Lundeen mentioned earlier. So we really want to present those in combination to voters to have a real clear sense of what they'll be in fact voting on going forward. So,
Chris, let me just beg for economic analysis of that. The reality is, my perception, my hypothesis is that the taxpayers will never see another Tabor refund in their lives again. In fact, the combination of 1311, which is a marketing budget to support 303, will in fact expand government exponentially as we move forward. It will essentially take the restraint that has been created by Tabor away from Colorado, just based on the math and the curve that it creates. So the analysis of that, so that it's not just me flapping my gums, but people actually saying, no, here's the true economic analysis, would be hugely beneficial.
Great, thank you. And look forward to having this conversation with you and members as we do that work and push that out in the coming months. So I don't see any other questions coming in. Getting text, we're past our time. So thank you very much for
hand in the air.
We have a hand.
I'll stay.
If we have a little bit of time, if we have a few minutes, Ted, did you want to ask a question, or did you want to type it in?
No, I'll be much quicker. Well, maybe
go for it
if I do it verbally. Thank you, Representative Byrd and Leader Lundeen, for joining us. Appreciate the work that you both did throughout the session. One comment on 213, but I don't want to go too far down because we're running out of time, as Chris said. What I hope the legislature understands is two things. Sometimes less is more, right? We don't need our imprint on everything just to say that we helped in theory, provide more affordable housing or more housing supply. You have to attack the entirety of the housing continuum. You can't just pull out ADUs or upzone mature neighborhoods and think you'll get out of the mess that we're in. Master plan communities are built at twice the density as current mature neighborhoods. So we need to figure out ways to actually build more master plan communities at higher densities. And then you'll not have this NIMBYism come out. And I understand, Representative Byrd, you're right. People, it is their opportunity to redress, government or address government and bring the redress to government. But it's been monopolized by the NIMBYs, that process. So something has to change there. And I don't necessarily think that's trading it for a state entity to make those decisions, but something has to be done. And I think where I applaud the governor is that he brought forward this conversation. And the builders have never had more friends in local government asking us what they can do better. And that's good in its own right. On property taxes though, my question, what would be the alternative? Senator Lundin, you mentioned, let's take this to a special session and really hash out where we're going to provide meaningful relief, and we can talk about the shell game or whatever, however you characterized it. But what, in your minds, both of you, from, kind of center left, center right, what would your prescription be for property tax relief?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be really quick because since we're up against time, ran an amendment on the floor to 303 that would have said, let's not refer it. It doesn't need to be referred to the people. They don't have to give up their taxpayer bill of rights refund or a portion of it in order to get at this. I said an 11% reduction on residential and an 11% reduction on non-residential, and didn't create all these additional strata. The creation of additional strata that preferences renewable energy agriculture, formerly agricultural land, is a policy nuance that is absolutely unnecessary to this conversation. The net effect on that, and I'm still working with Ledge Council and quite frankly, the folks over in the Joint Budget Committee's staff to develop, the net effect was about $150 million of state money would have been required. Okay, that means we need to come up with $150 million of savings. Too late to bring it in the last 10 days or 7 days of the legislative session. But if we'd had that conversation, as I asked the governor to do in the first week of the session, we could have engaged with the Joint Budget Committee and said, can we find $150 million to do a clean, actual reduction in property taxes? So there are pathways to do it. The conversation has been started, has been stopped. What's going to happen is the people that will benefit to the tune of tens of billions of dollars over the next decade, they will spend an enormous amount of money to pass HH because it will unrestrain the restraints on growth of government. And so don't know whether we'll ever get the honest conversation or not.
I would only add that I'm disappointed that there wasn't the opportunity to have a more robust conversation with 303 coming out at the very end. I think that poses some challenges where you don't get that robust opportunity to vet the policy. And I like the iron sharpening iron analogy, where perhaps better robust engagement would have given us some time to improve upon the policy. But one thing I think, in light of how dramatic people's property taxes are likely to increase, one thing that concerns me is there were proposals out there to just put a straight cap on assessment rates. And I understand that with a straight cap on assessment rates, that'll artificially depress our ability to fund services that we actually all depend upon. So what the right way is, what the right quantity is, what the appropriate belt tightening is, all of those I think are fair questions, but we all need to make sure we're appropriately funding government so that it will do the things we at least expect it to do competently. And also we want to make sure that whatever tax policy we put into place with the repeal of Gallagher and trying to rethink our way forward isn't something that strangles economic growth in the state of Colorado. So we don't want to pay any more taxes than necessary, but also if we, again, artificially depress the taxes that we do pay, we run the risk of choking off economic growth in our state. So, and then of course, threatening provision of important services. So all of these probably could have had better dialogue had there been better process, but I expect that since this goes to the voters, we'll have robust conversation to completely and thoroughly vet 303. and see if this is something that the voters appreciate or if they'd like us to take another crack at it.
Over under, Rep. Byrd, I'm saying $20 million. No, make that $40 million will be spent supporting HH. The money that's going to get spent to push this through, I think, is going to be enormous, but we'll see. Over under on 40 million. Do you think it'll be more or less spent to promote HH?
Less. 35 million.
Okay. Not much less. Okay, fair enough.
This is why we record these Zooms, just so you know.
Fair
This
enough.
is the
We'll
reason.
come back to the over under on that one. Rep. Byrd, you know, in the great tradition of Hugh McKean, who we all miss, I love you. I sincerely do. I'm grateful to serve with you. You are a wonderful, powerful influence on the policy of Colorado.
Thank you, Senator Lundeen, and you must know I feel the same about you. And I think the only voice missing here today was that of Representative McKean. Missed him dearly to this day.
Yes, we do.
Well, I have nothing more to add to that. Thank you for your service to both of you. Thank you to everyone joining this call and for supporting CSI and the work that we do. And we look forward to continued engagement and more high points than low points going forward. So thank you both and look forward to talking to you all soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.